Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to see you all here. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Michael Stepniak. It's my privilege as head of college here to welcome you to Queen's, to welcome some of you back after a few years, after a decade, after a few decades. But we're delighted that you're here. It's month 8 for me here. I'm learning about the place. It's both a community and it's an ambition. It's imperfect and it's restless in imagining something better and bold enough to continually shape it with an open heart. My sense is that communities that truly inspire young people are not sustained by slogans or ideas. They endure through the stubborn daily work of keeping faith in one another, through relationships that are tested and tended, through the examples of elders and peers who show the young, imperfectly and consistently, what it might mean to walk through the world kindly, truthfully. This is why tonight matters, why you matter. We are not here as strangers, we are here as friends, old and new. We are here to listen, to witness, and even to possibly be changed. In times like this, turning away from change is not neutrality, it's turning your back. And turning your back has a cost. I'm grateful for the many staff, students, fellows, and council members here. I'm grateful for the many Indigenous members in our community. Your presence reminds us that the ground beneath us is not just land underfoot, but country, alive with story and responsibility, a truth that still calls to us, asking how will we live together. Before we turn to our guest, we must begin with that ground, and I invite our student leader, Abbey, to now give the acknowledgement of country.
I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. I also acknowledge and am grateful to the traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who have been instrumental in Queen's reconciliation journey as an institution. I acknowledge the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. I also recognise their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. I pay respect to elders past and present and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge at Queen's and the University of Melbourne.
Thank you. This might be a good time to double check your phone in case your daughter's calling or your mum. Thank you, Abbey. Now, Kevin O'Brien. You can read Kevin's biography in many places. A descendant of Kaurareg and Meriam people from the Torres Strait, a visionary architect, cultural thinker, arguably Australia's leading architect of buildings that speak not only with clarity and courage, but with care for country. But there's something that matters even more tonight, certainly from my end. Kevin refuses the easy slogan. He shows us that design can be conscience, that stone, steel, and wood can carry memory, justice, beauty. He reminds us that spaces and the arts more broadly are never neutral. They either flatten us or they quicken us and set us free. We face many large questions in this land, none larger than the one that is as personal as it is shared. How do we shape the world ahead together? The voices we need are those that imagine boldly and care deeply, and Kevin's is one of those voices. It's my great honor to welcome you here among us, friends, Kevin O'Brien.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'll start by also acknowledging our First Nations people and culture from this place, but also our British and Irish cultures that many of you are connected to, and then our multicultural histories and people that make up modern Australia. It's something I think all of us have connections to in different ways through our families and what we do. I certainly do. I can tick all those boxes. But it does point to the thing that I'm interested in, which is the intersection of culture and modernity, and in particular, through my mother, the First Nations cultures, one that is typically or historically stereotyped into, I guess, imagery and particularly in architecture, a version of what architecture could potentially be about. And I think this slide up here is what I'm pointing at. It is to do with a house I did for my young family at the time, back in 2011 in Brisbane. There's a lot of things going on inside that building, but it is absolutely about modernity and culture. How do they inform each other, not in a nostalgic, stereotyped kind of way, but in one that just confronts what we're dealing with right now. What is it that makes, in my view, that a condition of Australia? It's, in my view, a genuine Australian identity that's not forced. There's a few things in there. Probably heard my name's Kevin O'Brien, so there's a very healthy suspicion that the Irish infiltrated my mother's family. So therefore, there's some good humour, as you'll probably find during the course of this speech. But what I'm showing here is that at the top, you can see those little leaves. They're Bodhi leaves. And there's 99 of them on the wall, and it was designed by an artist called Fiona Foley. She's a bachelor woman from Fraser Island, just up from Brisbane. Internationally held artist, incredible thinker, and a very dear friend. But in my view of what the house might be about, you can make a house in two ways. One, it can be a collection or a village of things. And on the other hand, it can be one entity. This is trying to be both, and I'm not sure I pulled it off, but I had a good go at it. At the centre of the house is the thing I value most, and it's a hole to the sky. And beside that hole is this work that Fiona designed and had me install. Fiona Foley is about this tall, and after I finished installing that, she said that the house was now worth something. The other things going on in this image is that the aperture to the top is actually directly referencing the land plot that my grand-uncle Koiko Eddie Mabo from Murray Island used as the plot in the Great Mabo case. So to make that the sort of centre of the house that received light and sort of allows light to pour into the upper levels is kind of a thing that I'm reminded of every day, but also the intention of those Bodhi leaves by Fiona was that they're off the Bodhi tree that is the tree that Buddha found enlightenment under. Now, she's not Buddhist, but she's very concerned with this idea of changing people's perceptions. So in my sort of agnostic/abnostic way, I embrace those kinds of ways of seeing. The other thing in that image is what is beyond, and it's not a fence, it's a barbecue, which some friends from university days back in the 90s and 80s happily bought the house behind about 15 years ago, and we ripped the fence down, and the first thing we did was build a barbecue to fraternise over. Changes the way you engage with your neighbours. Certainly up in the islands where my mother's from, no one has fences. It is a genuine village, and that's the way the children grow up. The idea of the boundary, if you like, is on the horizon. So our kids grew up running between the two properties. I didn't have to build a pool, we could use theirs, which was fantastic. And dogs ran between all these places. So it was a really nice way to bring two young daughters up. one of which is Abbey Dempsey's good close friend. The other thing that's in that image is on the left. You can see those triangles carved in. That motif is directly from the islands and the Straits, and the triangle is something that you make by carving, and it's a technique of removing matter. So it was either happening on the skin, it would happen on barks, on timbers, and it became something that guided, I guess about 15, 20 years ago, a whole lino cut kind of expertise that was guided by the likes of Dennis Nona and a few others from up that way. But I thought it would be great to set it into the ceiling, because what it does, again, it receives light from that column that has those little things around it, and it just pushes light into that concrete, and the concrete stops being concrete, it becomes a texture, and it has a character that then infuses that space with a, not an identity so much as a comfort, and that's what I like about the idea of bringing opposites together. Something as heavy as concrete that can be made or rendered to feel light is a real skill, I think, and I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm trying. And the other thing is that at the end of the day, the thing that matters is that table with 4 chairs around it, because as a setting to have conversations, to break bread, share stories, I think that's a pretty amazing space, and that's how we use it even today. But at that point, so that was 2011, the Brisbane floods had just finished, and I was moving into that house, but I was also getting ready for this exhibition at the Venice Architecture Biennale. A couple of days before I left to install this over in Venice, that's when Fiona turned up with all those Bodhi leaves and thought it would be a good idea at the height of my stress to stand up and put scaffolding up and erect those Bodhi leaves. So, and I'm glad she did, because it was very therapeutic. But this little exhibition was interesting because at one scale I was very deeply focused on this technique of removing matter. You can make a door handle not by assembling one, but by taking or carving it out of a handle. You can make space by carving it away as opposed to assembling it. I thought at the other end of the scale, how could you think about a city? Or how could we think about what Australia is in terms of emptying space out of it that could be not reclaimed as country, but would allow country to come forward. And what I did in conjunction with a couple of others, Michael Markham, Gina Levenspiel, some friends down this way, some friends in Sydney and Brisbane, is that we set up this idea that everyone got a street Refidex page. You had to trace it in pencil, and then with an eraser, erase half of it. And you had to then tell us why or how you erased it, what's the logic, the intention or the ambition was to reveal your understanding of country. So country's become a very fraught term, I think, in the last decade or so, particularly the last decade. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. I wondered what it meant or means to people who aren't from a First Nations background. How do they see it? And for the most part, these 50-odd submissions had the courage to kind of confront it and dive into this thing and see what it meant. So we got some really interesting observations where parts of the city, it wasn't about erasing the city, it was about removing, it wasn't about removing the city per se, it was about revealing country. The technique obviously is carving. And in the way of that particular exhibition, it was an official event, not in the Australian Pavilion, down the road though. It had a performative side to it. So the idea of country from my perspective and the way I grew up with it was that it was something that fire was used to manage its conditions. So you use fire like a lawnmower almost. So every week it'd burn a little bit down, a little bit down, a little bit down. And it keeps it in a productive state, and it also keeps the country in a healthy state. So the first time I witnessed this, I was about 10 years old up in the islands, and an uncle and I went out camping, and he set the whole island alight that we were on, and I was kind of mortified, a little bit scared, and he sort of explained that was his job, was to go over and do that in that particular month. But anyway, I was a bit in awe. So but it stuck with me. So probably no surprise that on the opening night I burnt the drawing. So that was the performative side, just to bring home the idea of country being It's not a notion out there, it's something that you're actually tangibly connected to. Yes, there is a spiritual dimension, but there's one that actually keeps it in a productive state, and that fire is the means of doing that. There's nothing worse in North Queensland than letting country go to rack and ruin by not firing it, because it sets it up as a very dangerous situation. You know how the fuel builds up all throughout the year, and you can end up with catastrophic fires, catastrophic carbon outputs. And as a side, in my other hat as a principal at BVN, we support the Northern Territory fire management systems to gain our carbon credits. So we're sort of putting our money where our mouth is. At that same exhibition, and this is where I was starting to drift and get more involved with artists. I'm not claiming to be one, because you can't have two masters in my view, but we had these photographs, and I was really interested with, again, this thing about opposites, not necessarily trying to reconcile them, but just presenting them and just letting them sit. And I don't know if you can make out in this image, but in there, there's it's a typical Queenslander, the classic sort of timber house that we have in Brisbane and the rest of Queensland. And a lot of those timber houses were built using first growth timbers or old growth timbers. And the thing about the old growth timbers that I was fascinated with is that in working on those and being on sites building while I was a student, when you got to the old growth timbers, they were like steel. So you could have a section that big spanning the whole room, and you had to pre-drill using very special drill bits to allow the nails to go in. They were so hard. And so we have things like ironbark, and that's what they were called. But the other thing about those trees is that there was documented evidence of certain groups throughout Queensland, even into New South Wales, and I believe into northern parts of Victoria, where First Nations communities, one of the death rites was to encase the body and bury it in a tree, and the body would be subsumed into the tree. So I had this sort of thought the whole time that when I was working on some of these houses that there were people in the structure, but the carpenter's hand was in the construction. And I just liked that idea of the two things sitting there. So from Fiona Foley to having a go and thinking a bit more deeply about what architecture could not necessarily demonstrate, but actually enable, I started to spend more and more time with artists, and I could feel myself over the last 10 years in particular drifting more across into that space, not to get in front of the artists, but to get behind them and support the endeavours. I've been very clear with this group of artists who are very close friends and I work with that I have a much better grasp of gravity than they do. Some of the things they've asked me to do were just quite ridiculous, to be honest. And as an architect and having that sort of analytical view on things, I think having the conversations with them and what they're trying to achieve in terms of that art and that culture is something that I find really fascinating, and it brings one to life, I think, and that's why I love it. But I'd started a conversation with an artist called Archie Moore, and in this particular work, this was in 2016 at the Sydney Biennale, it's called Bennelong's Hut, and the bigger narrative that he sort of invented around it was to do with this idea that Bennelong was effectively a diplomat in Governor Phillip's estate. And the bigger theme for the Biennale that year was embassies. So you had this really interesting question, which you didn't try to answer, which was how can you be in an embassy in your own home? Because that's effectively what this house was. And the way we positioned it was that it's just up in the Botanic Gardens above, looking down into the Opera House. And I guess the quintessential view of the Opera House is the long one, where you get the shells, the copulating turtles kind of elevation. But very rarely do you see it like this, where it's actually reduced and put right down into a box almost. And the only way you got that view, which is the one on the left, is when you come out the doorway on the way back out. And the doorway's about this high. So when you do come out, you've got to bow to the Opera House, which is my contribution, which I thought was a good one. The other thing about this is the shorthand, and this is where I think having some kind of cultural connection becomes a shorthand in the way things are understood. Archie was very clear that the outside of this was to replicate Bennelong's hut from historical records, which we did. But he said the inside had to be like his grandmother's humpy from Western Queensland. And the minute he said it, I said, oh, that's probably like my grandfather's humpy. It smells like kerosene, right? And he said, yes, of course it does, because that's what it was all about. So we didn't have to do much more than that. It just happened. I was able to do the drawings very quickly, and we knew that it was a dirt floor. We knew there was kerosene sort of pungent in the air, but also that little opening off here would frame a particular view. We managed to position that view so that it cut out most of the eastern suburbs. So you just looked across landscape, and it was like going into it was like stepping back in time when you went into this thing. So that began, that was the kickoff of a conversation with Archie, which has lasted the last 15 years and has produced some really interesting conversations and a couple of good pieces of work, I think. At the beginning of that period, the Australian Pavilion was built by what I'd probably claim as some of my favourite architects, Denton Corker Marshall, here in Melbourne. This building is, again, a building I think is fantastic because it understands what it's about, and that is it's there to serve art, not the other way around. And it's a very simple building. There's a threshold that you come through, and then you have a very square proportioned exhibition space, which is, I think, fantastic. I'd also argue all the exhibitions I've seen there, be it architecture or art, I don't believe have actually done the building justice. So when Archie came to me and asked me to do the exhibition design for last year's Venice Biennale show, Kith and Kin, I was mindful about the work that he wanted to present, but also how do you celebrate the architecture in itself? And one of the key conversations we had was how big is that table in the middle? That changed size a number of times just until it was tuned like a guitar string. You wanted it just to fill the space and feel right. We got to that. Same with the reflection pond underneath, pulling that in and out, and that was all to do with how we managed people's posture as they got closer to the table. And then a bench on the right-hand side. And again, that was about how did you sit, how do we position people in it, but within the volume itself as a piece of architecture. So the experience was as much architectural as it was about Ellie Buttrose's curatorial line, which I think was a genius thing to do. So Ellie brought these two works of Archie's together. So one is this sort of subjective history that's on the wall. It's a family tree. There's three very distinct layers that start up in the ceiling, sort of referencing the heavens and the stars, and they're more what you'd say are traditional Aboriginal names, the singular names. The middle band, just below the that sort of empty circle, which was to point to contact, European contact. The names underneath that start to become more, I guess, racially infused. So you get Black Jimmy, these sorts of terms that are slightly derogatory. As you get down to the bottom, then you become, people pick up surnames. So you end up with Archie Moore right at the bottom there. So it's a very personal view of his history and where people went missing and what happened. On the table are a bunch of documents, and they're from official records, and they document all the deaths in custody. So we have a personal history on the walls, but then we have official history on the table. And the purpose of that reflection pond was to keep people away from touching them, so you could just get to the point where you were bowing. Again, I like making people bow. You couldn't touch them, but you almost could. And being able to manipulate people's experience in the space is sort of one of the, I think, the purposes of architecture in support of the art. So this thing last year went on to be awarded the Golden Lion, which was an incredible accolade to receive on behalf of Australia. And for Archie and Ali, it was also an incredible thrill. If you didn't see it, it's opening in a couple of weeks at Goma in Brisbane, and I'd love to see you in Brisbane. But that sort of brings us to this conversation, because what happened to Subsabi almost happened to Archie during the course. There was an attempt politically to kind of examine what he'd been up to outside of that piece of work. And it mounted to nothing. There was nothing to see. Subsidi, on the other hand, because of those two works, that was, I think, post-2011, Hezbollah references, these sorts of things. Claire Chandler, the Tasmanian senator, managed to turn it into a political little football. And it's interesting that, you see February 7, Subsabi's announced, 13th of February it's rescinded, which is the same day she brought it up in Parliament. And post the federal election in May, Subsidi's now been reinstated. So one may say it's all good and well, but I think there's two sides to this story. I'm not going to connect the dots, you can see them. But I think the one that really sits around this that I think we really need to ask some bigger questions about is how free can art be? Whether it's a progressive form of art or whether it's a classical form of art. But I think, and I believe, the minute we start censoring art, we might be just killing off a bit of our soul as a nation, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think I started to get a profile with artists because I got dragged into urban theatre projects in Western Sydney, and they said, we want to do a soundbox, and it's to celebrate First Nations stories, but through sound. And sometimes it would just purely be music, sometimes it would be spoken word. It was very much up to Daniel Browning, who also works part-time on the ABC, but also he's an incredible sound artist, and he puts together these pieces that are quite amazing. And the idea of this box was that it would go around different parts of Australia, different countries, and he would source those stories and those beats, or those heartbeats from those sort of places and compose something. But the brief at the start was that they wanted this thing to look Aboriginal, and I didn't quite know what that meant, and I suggested maybe I'm not the right person. Again, I'm starting to get, at that point, a little bit stronger about what I think a modern identity is about, and for me, that's about technical precision, making the space work. And what you can't see in that image is that inside it's an asymmetrical egg-shaped plan. And I stole that from a house in Sweden, which was built for a couple. She was partly deaf, and the architect at the time designed it because he'd figured out it avoided the reverberation that was potentially going to drive her mad. But I just looked at it and said, well, that's the perfect space and size and shape for sound. If it's good enough for the Swedes, it's probably good enough for us. So I copied it in plan. Now the difference being is that in his, over in Sweden, it was beside a fire. I said, well, this one will be about the ground. So there's no floor in this thing. We had this installed during, it was installed just before COVID hit Melbourne a couple of years back. And it was only meant to be here for a month, but because of COVID, it had its longest running season for 2.5 years. So it was locked up at the Botanic Gardens over by the War Memorial for some time. And part of the, I guess, the ritual of setting this thing was to see if we could infuse the smell in this thing, and that was to do with, I wanted to burn the ground first, put this box on, you'd have that lingering kind of burn smell, and off you'd go. And unfortunately, we couldn't pull it off with the Botanic Gardens, but we sort of ended up with the second best version, which is because of the longevity of place, or the pavilion being there, it kind of killed the grass anyway, so we got there in the end. But the thing too about it that I liked, and Daniel liked, and those who experienced it liked, was that when you go into something like that in my view is technically refined, and there's an idea about how light works, and we had another light artist, Karen Norris, who does the Bangarra lighting shows, you get this incredibly immersive space that it's just something you have to experience, because you feel it when you take your shoes off, and you're invited to do that. You put it on the ground. Some of these sounds like bull roarers roaring, and you feel that bass go up through your feet, up, and you can feel it in your heart. It feels like it's going to pound out of your chest, and then the lights are following it. So it's an incredibly amazing experience. And the other thing is we made sure none of the works went longer than 45 minutes, which is about as much as most people can take. It's also just under the 50-minute mark, which is the amount of oxygen in that space before people actually fell asleep. So we timed it very well. Now I'm starting to get a profile with all these kind of performing artists. So I've fallen into this little hole, and I'm finding it fascinating. So this is back in 2019, again, another show with the Sydney Biennale, or the Sydney Festival, sorry. And it was just on behalf of Henrietta Bird, who was the writer. It's called The Weekend, and it just followed a woman's experience over a long weekend in Redfern, but in the 2 public housing towers. And she's being pursued by drug dealers, by the police, by an ex-partner with a DVO on him, and it's an incredible story. We just made the most simple of sets. It was 3 mirrors, and within those mirrors, again, Karen Norris, the lighting designer, was able to simulate towers, the police, which is an obvious one, red and blue, but then when those lights went out, the way that the story was allowed to come forward and all of these other things just amplified it was it's something triggered in my mind that I thought, maybe I'm not a good architect, I need to be over in this space. Oh yeah, hold that idea. Then I fell in with this guy, Stephen Oliver, who's, I don't know if you might know him, he's a comedian, slightly naughty program that was on the ABC called Black Comedy. There's a character in there that he plays which is quite a vibrant character, is the best way to describe it. So that's him toned down. In real life, he's that times 10. So he's quite a hard character to work with if you're trying to just get work done. But this story was a really deep one because it confronted suicide, which is a very big topic and very big thing we confront in a lot of First Nations communities and our own families. And this just followed a family dealing with one of their sons suiciding and the whole breakdown and what it meant spiritually and culturally, and then just in terms of the kitchen being the place where this whole thing played out. It was a very amazing thing to be part of. And then he switched from that sort of intense behaviour into his cabaret show. So he went back to the ABC character, and he's very funny and he's vibrant and, again, a bit naughty, but it's sort of, I'm starting to become more aware in the storytelling that yes, there is a bad history, don't get me wrong, and I'm not undervaluing it. There's also some real hope and some real genuine comedy that sort of makes one feel alive again, and this was that show. I had sore cheeks from laughing at him so hard during rehearsals, but it sort of, it brought back hope into these things. And then, again, straight after that, I got brought in to do a set for a short film that went on to qualify for the, what are they called? The Academy Awards in the US. And this particular story went sideways into the Torres Strait. And John Harvey, who's from Saibai Island up in the Straits, told one of our ancestral stories, and it's about the mud skippers that when the tide's out, you see them jumping. And they're quite mesmerising. You can sit there, watch the sunset, and these little fellas just keep going. But they're, as an ancestor, they're also the thing that grounds you in your memory about where you're from, where you belong. And the story is very simple. It's just following this lady who'd left the islands, was working in a laundromat in Brisbane, and that she gets called back to the islands. And this film is beautiful. It was quite incredible. And to be part of it was a real thrill. And then last year, dragged into this thing, which is for Queensland Opera, and it was about the story of the Queensland, the Torres Strait workers who went across to Karratha to lay, I think they did something crazy. It was like 15 or 20 kilometres of track in one day, which is still a world record for laying track. And it just follows their arc, wanting to get out of the islands to get across. And this is when we were still living under the Act in Queensland, so you still needed to get permission from the Aboriginal protector to leave those places. So to go from the islands, blue, green seas, fabulous seafood, palm trees, all this sort of stuff, and then end up in a desert building a railway, it was seen as an exotic option. And it was an incredible story to behold. At the same time, Dear Brother, which then examined 3 brothers coming down from Cairns, from the rainforest, looking for how they might, in modern terms, understand an initiation that might occur. And that's all the story is about. They went through an initiation, but not in the way of cutting and self-mutilation. It was to do with what they had to encounter in the city and what they had to bring with them and hold on to in terms of their culture and their identity in the city setting. So you can see I'm getting my sales up here. I'm thinking I might be onto an alternative, not lifestyle, income. Well, not even income, sorry, it's the arts. It's another possibility in terms of what I might do with my time. But then this dropped, and it dropped in quite some time ago. But Isaac Drandich, who's the First Nations creative director for Queensland Theatre, sent this to me late last year, just after those last two shows. And to go from a high of those and then to be reminded of this cartoon, we've got to think about the context of this. This was on the back of the intervention that happened in the Northern Territory, 2007 I think it was, but this sort of came out in the Australian back then, and there's a lot of people in our communities, particularly men, who felt targeted out of that. It infected all of us in that community, and it was a really hard, that cartoon got legs, believe it or not. But, you know, there's a silver lining to everything, and Thomas Mayo ended up inviting, on the back of a hashtag he started, Indigenous Dads, which we all contributed to, he brought together a bunch of writers who wrote these letters, and they were letters from fathers to sons, from sons to fathers, from fathers to daughters, and what's amazing about them when you read them is that they don't talk about football, actually talk about real stuff, about the things that actually connect us. You know, I want to talk to you, my daughter, or my son, or my father. And it was one way of, it kind of united the community, and it also, for us at least, just reminded us of what our strength in our culture and identity was about. And then he said, can you design the set for the show? We're turning it into a theatre production, which I did. And we had these 5 fantastic actors. I'll start from the right. Waniga Blanco, Aaron Peterson, Jimmy Barney, Trevor Jamison, and Kirk Page. And so all of these guys are incredible actors. They have great theatre chops. They've been in films, all those sorts of things. But all of a sudden, there's those 5 guys, myself and Isaac, who's the Noongar fella from Perth. So you've got like 7 blokes sitting around, and not once did we talk about football, which was incredible. But we did. It was an amazing, transcendental sort of experience. We just finished in Adelaide on Saturday night, did a 4-week season there that was mostly sold out. The 4 weeks before, we were in Brisbane, mostly sold out. It's got some great reviews. And it's been a real pleasure to be part of that. But the real learning that's come out of that is, and it's taken me a while to actually get to that point, is like how confident one can be once you're comfortable and familiar with your own culture and your identity. Not in a way where you have to sort of punch someone in the face with it, but that you can just have an inner strength. And the conversations with these guys was exactly that. So I wouldn't be a good architect if I didn't finish on an explanation of architecture. Over the last 5 years while I've been doing this, the big project I've been working on is the National Gallery for Aboriginal Art in Alice Springs. It's highly controversial. This is our second go at it. The first go got stopped with the change of government last year, so we've had to start again. We'll compete for it again and then start it again. But things are looking good, I think, because it's more aligned, I think, now in this second iteration to the things I'm really, really focused on. I'm going to explain it in 5 slides. So in the first one, we start all our projects with research, and that research starts with country in that community. So in Alice Springs, it's Arrernte country, and with the benefit of having done it once already, we'd spent a good 1.5 years speaking with people, with community, with the traditional owners, the entire spectrum of opinion on this, from against to for, supportive, quiet, loud. But the great thing is that we understood the country better as guests in it, and that McDonnell Range is a caterpillar dreaming story, which has very clear meaning for that community, and the idea that when you look out into that landscape, into that country, that it would somehow affect the actual work seemed kind of obvious in a way. Not mimic it, just play second fiddle to it and help amplify it. So the move in that way of thinking was that all of these bits of that landscape, certain hills, certain corridors, if you like, would be framed and brought within the building. So we needed to make spaces that could receive it. In the same way you make a space to receive light, you make a space to receive that piece of country. So it's the character, it's the identity of that space. And to do that and to sort of help distill that idea, we as architects refer to this thing called the partie, and the partie is like the very simple diagram that tries to illustrate what the intention is. And all I was trying to do with this thing was make a building that floated off the ground, so the stories that would be told within it would be held off it, but also it would become a place from which you could see the other part of the culture that this thing was immersed in, which is Arrernte country. And architecturally, the way to do that is we took the atrium that is typically the thing that runs down the middle of a gallery, we put it to the side of the building, and that was it. That was the one device or the one move that helped demonstrate how this experience could work. So to the left, out that big window, it frames a view of that whole McDonnell Ranges. So you see, as you're moving up through this building, parts of that country are revealed to you as a living, breathing, contemporary of the now experience. And then on the right-hand side, the galleries that will be at the curator's beck and call will be determined by them. So you'll have culture as an object inside, then you'll have culture in the landscape to the other side. The way I thought about the movement was simply from a couple of the canyons that I went to, in particular Emily's Gap, where you walk along beaches on a very slow sort of incline, and then you hit the range and you go vertical. And when you get to the top, you get the view. It's that simple, and that's what this thing's replicating. And in that way of thinking about it, you arrive at the identity of the architecture. So I didn't start with it and say, I'm going to make this thing look like a goanna or do these other things, play to a stereotype. This is a technically resolved, very finely tuned building that is all about, in the same way I believe the DCM one does, this is about allowing art and culture to come forward. And the purpose of this building is to sit back behind it. So I've already heard, it just went out in the press probably about a month ago, so I've already started to get the usual responses that it doesn't look Aboriginal and it doesn't do all these sorts of things, and it's all about the aesthetic and whatever. This is a very precise building, and I'm looking forward to this thing getting on site towards the end of the year. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm going to just start things off with a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Your speaking reminded me of a really fine mentor who said the purpose of making music is to play it so quietly that people are drawn into it as opposed to pushing it out. And I was thinking of that in a way when you were speaking. Your journey has been a really interesting one on the career side, and you spoke of moving towards the arts, towards the visual arts. In a place like this, there are many young people, and I wonder about one thing. I wonder about your opinion of that. To what extent do you really need to understand where you're from and where you belong to have the courage to explore and move forward? How did that play itself out, if you wouldn't mind sharing, in your own life?
I think it's incredibly important, and it's one that's taken me quite some time to get my head around. So I was one of the first from my family to go to university, and I do recall in the architecture school being with fellow students who were sons and daughters of architects. They'd grown up with this thing. And they're also very comfortable in their own skin, and they were very clear and proud of where they were from. And I wasn't at that point when I was going through university. I was still finding my way, understanding I'd very much packaged off going home to the islands every year. That was my experience up there. It couldn't possibly help inform what I need to do.
And those two disconnected.
It was absolutely disconnected.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until, I think it was 2005 and 6, I went back and did a Master of Philosophy at UQ under Paul Memmott, Dr. Paul Memmott. And it kind of opened up a few doors and reinforced the way being comfortable or recognising what it is from, at least at a very high conceptual level, what it is about your culture or your identity that can help inform whatever it is you do. And the other thing about that term identity is that it's not one thing, it's made up of so many things. And the sum of all of that is kind of the way that sort of pushes one forward, I think. But that body work, certainly there's a thesis that came out of it and whatnot, and there was an invitation to continue on with the PhD, and I politely declined because I thought I'd murder him. I didn't really want to hang around and do that anymore, but it was great because it meant I naively went out. I was telling someone earlier that I naively went out and opened up a small practice. I had no work, and the first project I did was for Fiona Foley, and because I also had no work, I ended up building it for her as well. So she got a great deal. She paid me in paintings. And then things were able to flourish after that. But knowing I didn't enter architecture for commercial or matters of commerce, it was actually to find something to see what it is we're going to amplify, bring to the front. And it couldn't have been done if I didn't have a clear understanding of what I could bring to the table, I think.
Yeah. You're being involved in a really remarkable range of projects, and people may or may not know that you're currently involved with the city of Brisbane and preparing for the Olympics in 32 in a huge project, right?
Yeah.
You're able to navigate many worlds, commercial,
Yeah.
and otherwise. What does it mean for you making transitions for types of projects, focus of projects, size of projects? At its essence, what's the same thing that's always there that you find you bring to that work?
Yeah. Those projects are big, complicated projects, 100 million up to $1 billion. They're big projects, and we're part of big teams. And the thing that has helped me carve my way through it, funnily enough, isn't from architectural philosophy. It was from sitting on boards with a guy called Noel Pearson from up in the Cape. And I sat on a number of his boards, and he would talk to me at great length about this idea of modern Australia being these three layers in terms of our history: First Nation, British Irish, and then post-white Australia policy with multicultural immigration. And I ended up generating a series of drawings around that were sort of layers. And when you had those three layers, the thing in front of it then would be the layer that's the project. And inevitably, if you're in a room, and I tried this when we did the Cross River Rail, which is like a $9 billion project in Brisbane. We're in a room with 50 engineers who aren't really that artistically inclined. But the minute I put the diagram up, everyone in that room was from around the world as well as Australia, and everyone it was able to communicate that we all had skin in that game, that we all had a part to contribute. And then the two layers in front of it that we strive towards or move towards, the next one's technology. So the way of technology is the moment you start bringing it into a project or a building, it's obsolete the next day and it's already moved on. And then the last one is where do we sit, or how are we positioning this project on behalf of the world, as it were. And that thing is the thing that's got me through every project since. All of those things. So sometimes I've had to move and sort of have more Irish kinds of conversations, but then sometimes have more, Kaurareg type conversations, or be architects or whatever. But our contracts guy in BVN, who's a national judo competitor and champion, he better described it and said, like, there's 9 classic judo moves. And he said, depending on what's coming at you or what's happening to you, you react accordingly. And I got it. And that's what I do. It's not, you've got to react correctly.
Yeah. I know that people will have questions from the audience, and so I'd like to open it up, and I know that Michelle might have a microphone coming around.
Thanks.
And if you just introduce yourself so people...
Oh, I'm
Hi, Liberty.
an MCR. So I'm a graduate student who's just graduated. I just completed my degree in Master of International Business, but I come from performing arts background, so yeah, mix of both worlds. So as Michael pointed out, your practice moved progressively from traditional architectural practice towards performing arts and even performance arts. So what do you think the two worlds feed and steal from each other? And also a quote from you, you said, architecture manipulates people's behaviors in space. And do you think the sweet spot in between, which is scenography, is where that function of architecture is magnified? Thank you.
That's a great set of questions. I think I'm on a bit of a journey at the moment. I'm not sure where it's going to go. I know all that stuff you just saw in terms of visual arts and performing arts certainly don't pay the bills. And when I do get to work with all the other people in those two sort of industries, if you like, eking out a living every day, it's hard to watch. But the thing that drives those kinds of creatives, I find, is something that I'm in awe of. There's just a fire that can't be put out or taken away from. And that is something I find when I do those sorts of projects is incredible therapy. All those works I'm doing are after hours. So I still wear, a big hat in the practice we have. We've got 300 people and big projects, and that takes up most of my week. But getting in with those people at the end of a day is kind of fills the cup. So I don't know where it's going to go. I suspect more of it's coming at me. So that's the context of trying to answer 3 of those questions. The last year about was it scenography? Is that what you were talking about? Yeah, dangerous, because the thing I'm absolutely against in architecture is scenography, in the way that, or certainly one that's painted on to say today it's this and tomorrow it's that and whatever. Because my way I was taught and the thing I subscribe to is that the space is the thing. Space and light are the two things we're supposed to really have a head around as architects. And it's very easy to fall into I'm part of a big commercial practice, but we're very mindful of this other role of architecture and what it can achieve, what it can do, and that's sort of where I sit. The difference is it takes 5 to 6 years to get some of those buildings built. That last thing's been going for now 3.5 years, 4 years. By the time it gets built, and there's still a lot of hurdles and another territory election to go, and you never know what'll happen. We could get to the end of it and have nothing to show, but in that same time period, I've managed to work on 6 or 7 shows and get stuff built, which is sort of the curse of an architect, I think.
Kevin, thank you for the presentation. My name is Richard, and Owen Parnaby was master, and that's all I'm saying about when I first came to Queen's. Kevin, what's your fondest aspiration about how your work might influence our nation's journey towards truth, treaty, voice, and reconciliation?
I think this is where I probably didn't fully explain the idea of censoring, but I think that when we're censoring those kinds of conversations, they tend to start in the arts, I think. And when we do that, we don't allow the truth to come forward and we don't allow things to heal. And what I found on that that show, the Dear Son one, with the five brothers there. Some of the things that got brought out and that people were settling with, there's some sorry business during one of the weeks. It's incredible when you just allow things to come out, get said. They're not forgotten, but it allows people to come together and heal around certain things. I'd like to think I'm playing my part because I'm contributing to it. So I think that's what I've always understood the role of the arts to be. The role of the artist is therefore to imagine what's over the horizon, which I think is really important. It gives us space. And also I think that freedom to imagine what's over the horizon, surely that's what should sort of effectively define what it is to be in a democratic society. So if we're centering artists, there's something really, insert expletive, I think.
Maybe following up on that, and it maybe relates, it connects this with your reference to history, who gets to tell it, and what is history. An architect, like an artist, is trained so rigorously, right? Has a concept that she or he is following of what good technique is. Mm-hmm. But all the while, I think the goal is honesty, right? All the while, the goal is having access to the truest center of your own self. I would think that's the case. What do you really have to say and how to get at that? You come across sometimes these artists that have something to say that is not quite fully comprehensible, and yet it moves so profoundly.
Yep.
Right? And then people can write about it and try to explain it, but it moves. And it sounds like along the way you've found some of those people, whether intentionally or otherwise. Have they in any way informed your own way of thinking about architecture, your own craft, what it means for you, to be truly honest in the space of your own work?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think if anything, I have an immense respect for artists, whether visual or performing. Because I think the difference between an artist and an architect is that as architects, we've got gravity, and we also stay within a box, and that's a regulated, legislated box that we have to stay within, where the artist has the luxury of starting there and going beyond it. And a clearer example of that is a Venetian theorist, P.V. Orelli, and he talks about the difference between the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks. And he said the ancient Greeks had a wall, and they built their city inside it, and you could only be Greek if you're by DNA in that space. But the Romans said, no, the horizon is our limit. We're going to go over it. And the kind of architecture they came up with was infrastructure, and the idea that the house could be replicated. So I think the difference in those two is the thing I kind of try and see in terms of trying to find a limit or find where I can go beyond and, don't appear to hit a wall, so to speak, that you can take a wall down, you end up with a park. Take a fence down, you end up with a barbecue stand. Yeah. And one enables all these other things to occur. So.
And Rebecca in the back.
I'm Janie Anderson. I'm an art historian. I loved your talk, and I thought that you brought up all sorts of tremendous issues in relation to how you experience contemporary art. And the question, what I'd like to know more about is the museum that you're building, and the good news that now it's doing well. Are you conceiving this museum as a temporary exhibition space, or is it to be related to historic collections in the Northern Territory? I'm not really an expert, but I understand there are amazing collections that have never been shown in Darwin and elsewhere. So I'd like to know what the thinking is behind the exhibiting in this museum, and to know about the good things you hinted at that the Northern Territory government is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying I've never been nervous about speaking before until I met you earlier and realised there's an art historian with a Rhodes Scholarship behind her, so I was quietly petrified up here. That gallery it's a non-collecting institution, so I can't recall the exact percentage, but it's something like only 10% of Australia's collection of art in all our institutions is ever on display. It's a very small percentage. So the strategy on behalf of the Northern Territory Government and the leaders of this new gallery is that they would borrow from all the other institutions, the NGV, NGA, GOMA, QAG, and that's how they would work out their agreements. So in terms of the technical side of it, we just had to make sure the gallery achieved AA gallery standards, so we secure the environment, but also secure the work. So all the security's in place, but also the environmental things, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, I was going down a rabbit hole you don't want to hear about. But in terms of what's up for grabs for the curators, the intention is that it's any work by a First Nation artist, or an artist of First Nation heritage, I should say. So on one hand, it's going to be bark paintings, absolutely, but on the other hand, you're going to have the likes of Richard Bell screaming something at you from a painting. So you'll get the whole gamut is the intention, as I understand it. But oh yeah, could be, yeah. And they're big spaces. Those spaces, we've got 2 levels of galleries that are it's effectively similar to what the GOMA spaces are. So it's big, yeah. Fingers crossed we get there. So
Rebecca was...
Thank you, Kevin, for being here and inviting us into your journey. I'm really drawn to your intersectional approach in how you've taken architecture and culture and shared that with us. And you mentioned something in your presentation that the word country has become a fraud term, and there are people in this room who simply don't want to pay lip service to country. And you mentioned that people came together, had a yarn, and shared what country means to them. And I'm just wondering, in your own words, as people who want to cultivate country and understand what country is or what country isn't, what is country in your own words?
yeah, thanks for that. But for me, and it's going to change with a lot of other people, obviously. So to me, it's the thing you belong to. So and within that, there's 2 dimensions, and I think one of them is absolutely a spiritual connection to that place. It's something you belong to, but it's in your soul that you're connected to that place. But the other is having responsibility to manage it and care for it and keep it in a continual sort of sustainable state. And that's what it means to me. And the other thing about being able to do that, so I live in Brisbane and Sydney, sort of up and down, and then Mum's country is way up the other end of the state, so I don't get to contribute that much to the second bit, which is managing country. That falls on other people's shoulders. So those 2 things, what also connects them is the thing that makes culture. So it's the stuff you eat for breakfast, it's the stories that get told that connect it, it's having guidance from elders before you who know that country. And in the end, you can only, I think, really claim to be really bound to that country, you have to have your hands and feet in it. So even though I go, yeah, I'm a descendant of the Kaurareg and Meriam, I don't feel like I'm taking care of it because I'm nowhere near it. I'm not there every day sort of burning parts of it and managing how we hunt and eat and all that sort of stuff. So I fret when I hear people in our community talk beyond that experience, and it starts to become, in my view, it lessens the value of what country is and what our role as custodians in that. I think also where we are right now as a nation, I'd like everyone to be a custodian, because if you talk about it in those terms, that we're looking after it on behalf of the next generation and the next generation. Next generation, it seems to be a better ambition than figuring out how to destroy it for commercial reasons. So,
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks. Hi, Kevin. Steve. I'm from architecture, and mostly the big commercial practice part of architecture that you've referred to a few times. And you remind me a lot of lots of people I've met in the profession and the sort of intellectual power and rigour and curiosity and engagement with culture that sits in our profession but is so often unable to be brought to the table. And it makes me think about, the missed opportunity of architecture because of all the constraints around how architecture gets procured and how it fits into the bigger system. So I was just wondering, you're clearly a very reflective person. What do you wish people understood about architecture that, if they understood, would be allow it to have it maximise its potential to impact in culture and in cities and society?
I was hoping there would be no architects in the room so we could get away with all sorts of mischief. It's a good question. It's one, I don't know the answer to it, but the current sort of way I do respond to that sort of thing at the moment is to talk about the difference between belonging and owning. So probably like yourself, you're in a commercial practice, we do a lot of big high-rises and things for the likes of Dexus and all those sort of types. That's a transactional condition. They give us some money, we build a building, they make more money, the world keeps going around. And that's just a form of ownership. It's a matter of ownership, I guess. But when you're in another space, when it's talking more to this idea of belonging, it affects your behaviour because you act in a different way. And it's not transactional, it's absolutely relational. And when architecture is in that space, the outcome is a very different one. The things that matter and value aren't the square meterage and what the yield is. It's actually how do people occupy this thing? What's it about? What's its identity? What's its character? These other things that drive as much someone's house as a piece of public realm, cultural building like the gallery or a court or whatever it might be. So I think I've done towers as well, so I know exactly like yourself, what's in them, but when you get into the public realms, the questions are very different. They're not about yield anymore, and there's something I enjoy about that, because I think part of what can happen there is, like I was saying, the architecture can allow art to come forward in a really genuine way, and if we can synthesise the two, something really special, something of that place is allowed to come forward. I think.
Are there examples that you've seen in the commercial sector where, I'm struck, when you're talking about belonging, you think of soul and heart.
Yeah.
When you're talking about ownership, you think of wallet. You think of things external. Are there big commercial projects that you've seen that actually have been successful where there may be an element of ownership, but there is a real regard for belonging?
Yes, yeah, we've completed 2 towers in that way in Brisbane just recently in the last couple of years, and we've infused them with all that stuff I've just talked about, but also managed to make the building owners and developers incredibly satisfied because they've got the yield they needed, but also they've ended up with these, what we've called mixed mode veranda spaces that, because you can close them, they can still charge the same amount of rent for them. If they're external terraces, you can only charge whatever it is, 30% of that rent. So they loved it. Ground planes are absolutely of the public realm. We're celebrating some of the history in that site by engaging particular First Nation artists. There's an attitude of how the landscape, particularly the endemic landscape, was allowed to draw up into the building. It becomes character of the space. And it also drapes along the building edge. So I didn't bring a photo of it, but what it means is the experience of that tower and that going to work every day is a very different one from the building next door, which is a very famous Japanese architect that was just part of the marketing. I'm not sure if that's hit Melbourne here, but I haven't been paying attention as much, but Sydney, they cannot help. They fall over themselves to get the big name architect, and it's just another sort of glass form next to the next one. It's a bit of a lost opportunity there, I think.
And Kevin, I can't tell from what you've just been saying, were those features in response in large part to the brief, or was it something that the firm brought in addition to what it is that they were looking for in that transaction?
It was both. It was both. And those particular clients, who happened to be Dexys, actually, the people in that at the time were very open to the idea of how the public realm could determine a difference in the market for them. So they're looking at it in a particular way.
Yeah.
Well, they're looking at the idea of a planted public realm for people to occupy, to have their cups of coffee with friends, and it's becoming this particular building's an incredibly social part of the city now. But it's paid dividends for everyone, I guess. So people like going to that building and like working in it and like meeting their friends under it. With all the work leading up to the Olympics, we're also at a major intersection in the city. And all the engineers, there's a lot of speed dating going on between engineers and builders and all that, and they all tend to happen straight under our building in this sort of very long garden that has a cafe and a restaurant next to it, so we can see who's talking to who, which is great.
Yeah, very good. I know that there will be more questions, but I want to make sure that all of you have a chance as possible to interact with Kevin, so I think we're going to wrap this portion up, move down onto the floor. There are some drinks and canapes. I'm really grateful to our staff and to everyone who's helped put together. I know that our Dean, Dr. Sicarella, is going to have just one small remark, and then we'll gather, relax, and we'll talk a little further. Catherine?
Thank you, Kevin, for such a wonderful talk. I remember talking to our architecture tutor a couple of years ago, and he said to me, Catherine, the most important thing that I can teach my students is how to present their work in a compelling way, and you have really done that tonight. You've helped us see architecture in a way that goes beyond buildings, as something that is tied deeply to country, to our stories, to our histories that we carry into the spaces that we create. Your collaborations with artists that you've shown us have been a powerful reminder that every place that we inhabit has meaning, and that our task is to engage in that meaning respectfully and creatively. Thank you very much for your time and your insights, and please join me in thanking Kevin O'Brien.